On Matthew chapter 9. Matthew 9, I'm going to begin reading in verse 35, and it says, "And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them, because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. Then saith he unto his disciples, The harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth the laborers into his harvest." Let's go. You can go ahead and be seated. This morning I want to bring a message on the subject of compassion, and specifically compassion for others. It's not something we like to talk about. I'm going to pick on my wife for a moment. I look back there and she's shaking her head no, so I'm going to pick on my wife for a moment. Yesterday she asked me, "What are you going to be preaching on tomorrow?" And I told her compassion. She goes, "Are you going to tell me I have to be nice to people?" We don't like the idea of compassion. I'm in trouble now, especially since I looked back and she was nodding her head no, and I still told it. Be compassionate later, wife. It's something we don't really like to talk about. Compassion for others is something that is, if we look at our society, is something that's lacking. Now, our society that we live in is a kind of me-first mentality. We all understand that we live in a me-first type of society. It doesn't matter what's best for someone else. It doesn't matter how what I want affects someone else, because, to be perfectly honest, most people are so self-centered that they don't even notice that there is someone other than them. It's a little hard to care about another person when you don't even realize that they exist. But it's a me-first society. Compassion for others just isn't on, most of the time at least, just isn't on our priority list. It's if what is best for me happens to benefit someone else, great, but that isn't our concern. But also, compassion for others is an issue because don't crucify me for this, but let's just be honest here. There are some times that people simply annoy us. Now, if we're being honest, there are times that people just get on our nerves. I know that I'm confident I'm not the only one who thinks this way. I do love working with people, but there are times that people drive you crazy. None of you, of course, but other people. Actually, our teens at one point said that we should come up with a name for the teen department. So I came up with an acronym, FIRE, and most of them know what it is. It's fairly irritating and really exhausting. That's what I call them. But so I'm not talking about people here, but we get that way, that people can sometimes just drive us a little crazy. I'm one of those. I enjoy working with people. How do I say this? How do I transition this? I got myself off of my notes, and that's never a good thing. There are some people. I'll just jump into this. There are some people like my brother who can't stand working alone. He has to have someone to talk to, or he goes crazy. I'm not that way. I'm happiest when I'm working alone. No other people, no music, no sound, just me and my work. Because I'm just being honest here. Again, don't get too mad at me. But there are times people drive me crazy. I recently had a plumbing job I did that when I got on the job, I'm kind of one, I don't have a ton of extra time on my hands. So when I get there, I'm busy. I get work done in a hurry. So I got on this job and I went right to work. And the homeowner and myself had already talked about what they wanted, what the plan was. So I started doing that 3 or 4 hours into it. And I was just about done, and the homeowner comes driving up and tells me that they changed their mind on a bunch of stuff, on enough that I basically had to tear everything out. Well, let's be honest, that's annoying, But when we are having the attitude of people are annoying, and again, I'm preaching at myself a little bit, when we're having that kind of mentality that these people annoy me, it's awfully hard to have compassion on people when you're saying, boy, they annoy me. Isn't that true? You go from that person really annoyed me to I want to help that person. That just doesn't happen. Someone cuts you off while you're sitting in traffic, and it makes us all mad. Friday, I was driving home from Bo's house, and it is crazy to me. When you get off of 405 onto 167, I mean, we're sitting, there's a line of traffic for 2 miles that I'm stuck in, and there's going to be someone who is going to wait until like a half mile before, a quarter mile before, and cut in. And here's what I thought funny. So they cut in, and I wasn't happy about it, but oh well. Like a minute later, a car cuts in front of them, and they're screaming and yelling at the car in front of them because they just did exactly the same thing they did to me. But in that, it drives us nuts. You're sitting in traffic, and it makes us all mad, and that person gets pulled over a mile down the road. You don't think, oh, I have compassion, I feel bad for him. No, you don't think that. You know what you think? Serves you right. I mean, that's a guy who cut me off. Had he a mile down the road got pulled over, my thought would have been, ha, you got what was coming to you. Now, here's where I'm going with all this. Lately in my devotions, I've been reading through the Gospels, and God's really been kind of making something stick out to me as I read it, and that's just how many times in the Gospels specifically that it says Jesus had compassion on either an individual or a group of individuals. It's over and over and over. In just the Gospels alone, we see it 14 different times. The Bible tells us Jesus had compassion on someone. And in reality, I think that number could be much higher than that, because every time that Jesus gave sight to a blind man, it was because he had compassion on that person. And every time he made a lame man walk, it was because he had compassion on him. And every time he performed any miracle on someone, it was because he had compassion on them. And while I'm not going to look specifically at any of those, I think that we'll see as we go through the message this morning, we'll see that countless times through the ministry of Jesus, he did what he did because he had compassion on him. For the purpose of the message this morning, I'm going to only focus specifically on those times that the Bible tells us that Jesus had compassion. If we tried to look at every time that he showed compassion, we would be here until next Sunday. So I'm going to try and keep this specifically on those, like the passage that we started with in Matthew chapter 9, where verse 36, but when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them. And from that, and those examples, here's what I want us to see. I want us to learn how we, as Christians, need to have compassion. I think as for the purpose of the message, I should start out by making sure that we're all on the same page as to what compassion means, because we have kind of a false sense of it. We think compassion is pity. I feel bad for that person. And if we're not on the same page as far as what it means, we're going to have the entire message thinking two totally different things, and it's not going to make any sense to either of us. So that's not going to be worth any time at all. So I looked up in Webster's dictionary what compassion means. Here's what it says: sympathetic consciousness of others' distress together with a desire to alleviate, and this is the part that I think is really important, that drives us to action. It's not just sympathetic consciousness of their distress. That's where we normally stop the definition, that I see they're having a problem and I feel bad. But that drives to action. Let's put that in terms we use a little bit more today. Compassion is seeing others' problems, not being so stuck on ourselves that we don't notice them. See there is a problem and have a desire to help, and more than just a desire to help, but a strong enough desire that pushes us to do something about it. That pushes us to action, not just seeing there's a problem and thinking, oh, well, that's too bad, or saying something like, I wish they didn't have that problem, or I wish someone would help them, but actually getting up and doing something about it, inconveniencing yourself to help another. That's exactly the example that we see from Jesus in these passages as we go through this, that we're going to look at this morning. Is him not just seeing people and having compassion, saying, oh, that's too bad, but then it causing action. I'll give a little warning right as we get into this. I have a lot of passages I'm going to read in this message. You can turn to them if you like, but I'm not going to be waiting for you to get there, so you're welcome to try to keep up with them, but I'm going to be moving through them pretty quick. That being said, in these 14 occasions that Jesus had compassion, the Bible specifically says he had compassion. I see it kind of directed as he had compassion in 3 different areas. And that's what I want our focus to be this morning. The first is he had compassion on their physical needs. Let me give you a few examples of that. Matthew 14, verse 4. If you want to turn there, you can again. But Matthew 14, 4. And Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them and healed their sick. What's Jesus doing here? It says that he had compassion on them, and then where did it go from there? He healed them. He saw that there was a physical need. The passage doesn't give specifics about what it was that they needed to be healed of, but that he healed. Probably because in a multitude there's a bunch of different problems being brought to him. But notice he didn't have compassion on them and say, well, that's too bad that there are so many sick people that live here, and walk away. Now, he did something about it. His compassion drove him to action. Another example, Matthew 15 and verse 32, it says, Then Jesus called his disciples unto him and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they continue with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I will not send them away fasting, lest they faint in the way. He once again has compassion on a multitude of people, and the reason is a physical problem. They've been following for 3 days and they have no food. That's a problem. I mean, think about that. 3 days without food. I like food. Going 3 days without food, that would be terrible. In this passage, it's gone so far that Jesus is worried that if he sends them away, they're going to faint in the way. They're not going to make it home. It's gotten so far that they're not going to make it home. This isn't good. But it doesn't say that Jesus then says, that's too bad they're all hungry. I wish someone would do something about it. Or even, that's too bad they're all hungry. Here, disciples, go get some food. Someone needs to do something. No, it pushed him to action, which is why that passage in Matthew chapter 15 we know as when Jesus fed 4,000 men beside women and children, because he went into action. He did something about it. The entire reason that miracle happened, that is referred to so often, the entire reason it happened was because Jesus saw the multitude and had compassion on them physically. He saw a need and he did something about it. Another example, Matthew 20, verse 30 through 34, it says, And behold, 2 blind men sitting by the wayside, and when they heard that Jesus passed by, cried out, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. And the multitude rebuked them, because they should hold their peace. But they cried the more, saying, Have mercy on us, O Lord, thou Son of David. And Jesus stood still and called them, and said, What will ye that I shall do unto you? They said unto him, Lord, that our eyes may be opened. So Jesus had compassion on them, and touched their eyes. Immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. These 2 blind men sitting by the wayside, calling out for Jesus, they get rebuked. It doesn't discourage them. They just keep yelling for him. And Jesus, rather than joining the crowd and rebuking them, rather than just walking by pretending it didn't happen, has compassion on them and does something about it, and turns 2 blind men sitting by the wayside into seeing followers of him. I could give more examples of this, but we won't keep going on with this. Here is what's interesting about this to me, because we see the miracles during his ministry, but Jesus didn't come to heal people. That wasn't the purpose of his ministry. He could have still fulfilled his reason for coming to earth without healing one person. He didn't have to feed the hungry to fulfill his purpose of coming here to provide a Savior. That wasn't, the miracles had nothing to do with why he was here. He didn't come to do those things. That wasn't the purpose of his ministry. He came to seek and to save that which was lost, not to heal the sick, feed hungry people, and give sight to blind people. And yet, he was willing to go out of his way and help someone simply because, as the passages over and over show us, he had compassion on them. Simply because he saw their situation, and for this point, saw their physical need, and did something about it. As Christians, we ought to be able to learn something from that. As Christians, we're to be Christ-like. That's what the word Christian means, is Christ-like, modeling our lives after him. Bear with me for a moment, but how can we say that we're modeling our life after his when over and over, we see him have compassion on people and stop what he's doing to help them, and we don't have time to help someone. How can I say I am a Christian, I'm modeling my life after God, if I then follow that up with, well, I don't have time to stop and help this person? I have a pastor friend of mine that many of you know, Brother Dave Brown. In fact, he preached here a few years ago. Brother Brown gets picked on a lot for being on, as most people call it, Brown time, because he is late for everything. One time he was supposed to preach for my dad when we were in Astoria, and the service started that he was supposed to preach at, and he wasn't there yet, and the songs were going, and still no Pastor Brown, and it got late enough in the service that my dad actually stepped out and called his church, Yakima Bible Baptist, saying, is he coming? What's going on? And the secretary's response was, well, is it time for him to preach yet? Well, no, there's still a couple more songs. And she goes, don't worry, he'll be there in time to preach. And he was. Time to preach came, and he came walking in. And that's how he is. And a lot of people pick on him for that. But I went somewhere with him a while back now, and I figured out why. It's because it doesn't matter how busy Brother Brown is. If he sees someone in need, he's going to make time to stop and help them. The reason is he has compassion on people. He loves people, and when he sees a person with a problem that he might be able to help, he's going to. And that's really how we ought to be. I'm not saying that we ought to be late for everything. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm kind of if you're not 15 minutes early, you're 15 minutes late kind of guy. Actually, it's probably more than 15 minutes. But I'm not saying we ought to be late for everything, but we ought to take the example of Jesus and care enough about people that we make time to not just notice their physical problems, but time to try and do something about it. Time to try to help. First area that we see that Jesus had compassion on people was physical needs. The second area that he had compassion on them was compassion on their emotional needs. Now, I'm a guy. I try not to talk about anything that has to do with emotions. I am kind of a man's man type, and the area of emotions scares me. But in studying this, God led me here, and I don't want to shy away from where he was leading, so I'm gonna give it a shot. Because he had compassion on not just their physical needs, but also on emotional. We put a lot of emphasis on physical problems, and understandably, because that's what we see. If a person is blind, we can see that. And that's obvious to us, and okay, they can't see. That's a real problem. If a person can't walk, we can see that, and we recognize, okay, that's a problem. I can see that. It's the same with any other sort of physical problem. We can see it with our eyes, therefore in our mind it's real. But we tend to downplay emotional problems for a few reasons. First of all, we can't see them. You can't see that they are a real issue because you can't see with your eyes that they exist. But I think the main reason that we downplay emotional problems is simply the reason that I said I was shying away from this. We don't understand them. We don't understand them, and that scares us. We don't like things that we can't understand, and emotional needs, emotional problems don't typically make any sense, even to the person that's having them. I don't remember how old Kaylee was at this point. I keep looking over. I need to stop looking at my wife. It's going to be bad. She keeps making faces at me. I don't remember how old Kaylee was, but she wasn't very old when one night we were putting her to bed, and all of a sudden she just started bawling. My wife was saying she was 3 years old, and she's just sitting in bed bawling. And I'm like, Kaylee, what's wrong? Why are you crying? And her response was, 3 years old, tears running down her face. Her response was, I don't know, I just feel like I have to cry. She's 3 years old. I'm like, no, you're too young for this. Don't start this on me now. Emotions make no sense, even to the person that's having the emotions most of the time. We don't understand them. But whether we admit it or not, they are a real problem. And often they're a problem that on their own don't just go away. I'll give an example of that probably every one of us can relate to, and that's the loss of a loved one. My grandpa on my mom's side passed away. It was December 28th, 3 days after Christmas, I think, if I remember right. 3 days after Christmas, this December will be 8 years. 8 years is a long time. Now, when you start to look at all that happens in 8 years, when he passed away, Kaylee, who just celebrated her 8th birthday, she was just a baby. Zach, our youngest, wasn't even born yet. And yet still, while that is a long time and a lot happens in 7.5, 8 years' time, still, from time to time, I think about my grandpa and miss him. And I'm not going to lie, every single Christmas, it goes through my head. That you think, oh, it was right about this time that he passed away. Dealing with a loss is a real emotional need. It's an emotional problem. And when Jesus came, he had compassion on their emotional problem, their emotional needs. If you want to turn there, if you can, in the time I'm going to read it, Luke chapter 7, verse 12 through 15, it says, "And when he came nigh to the gate of the city, behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said unto her, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still, and said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he that was dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother." This scenario right here goes along the lines of the example that I just gave. The woman is weeping because she's just lost her only son. It mentions the fact that she's a widow. She's already lost a husband. Now she's lost her only son. But when Jesus saw her, rather than thinking what most of us would, oh, that's too bad, rather than just thinking it's sad and walking by, he did something. And this, as the verse puts it, this young man, this boy was back among the living, and the mother reunited with her son simply because Jesus had compassion and stepped in. Now, for us to, as a Christian, to do something about an emotional problems is hard. For one, we usually don't notice them. Most people hide their emotions well enough that we don't know that a problem actually exists, and that obviously makes it hard to do anything. But furthermore, even if we did see them, we wouldn't know what to do. I'm not Jesus. I may see someone emotionally having problems like the woman in Luke chapter 7, but I can't bring her son back. No, I can't really do anything that's going to help and have no idea what I ought to say. So what am I supposed to do? I'm going to make the answer really, really simple. Just show that you care. You know what I've figured out? I've figured out that most people, when going through something like that, going through some sort of emotional problem, they don't actually want you to do anything. They don't actually want you to say anything. They just want to know that you're there and that you care about them. Amen. What that is, that's showing compassion. Yes. So far we've seen Jesus had compassion on their physical needs. He had compassion on their emotional needs. And then lastly this morning, he had compassion on their spiritual need. If you look back at the passage that we started in Matthew chapter 9, I'm going to go ahead and read it again. Starting in verse 35, it says, "And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogue and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every sickness and every disease among the people." So he's preaching the gospel and he's healing sickness and disease. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them, because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. Notice the reason for his compassion. It wasn't because they were sick and diseased. It wasn't because they were sick and diseased. The crowd is around, and it has nothing to do with their physical appearance that he has compassion. It has nothing to do with their emotional condition. The compassion is because they're as sheep having no shepherd. And compassion on them because they were lost. Talks about that they're scattered abroad. Sheep without a shepherd, they're lost. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to do. That was the condition he saw these people in, is they're lost. They're a sheep having no shepherd. They have no one to show them the way. That's what he's talking about. That's why he goes straight from there into, he turns to his disciples and says, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. So the reason he goes into that is because what his compassion was is, there is sheep having no shepherd, and there's not enough shepherds. It's because what he's referring to is their spiritual condition. You think about this, as I know he's God, he knows everyone, but as a man, he was 100% man. As a man, he didn't know these people. They were just a multitude that was gathered around him, like so many had before and like so many would after. It's just another crowd. If you give me a little bit of liberty here, it was just a big bunch of strangers. Again, I know he's God, he knows them, but as a man, it was just a big bunch of strangers. And yet, when he saw them, this big group of strangers, he was concerned about their soul. He was concerned about their spiritual need. He had compassion. And when he saw that need, he did something about it. The passage shows us that he preached the gospel of the kingdom, but he went further than that. He went to the cross so that he could take the price of their sin on himself. He did that because he had compassion on this multitude. So that if they simply called on him, they could be rescued from hell and spend eternity in heaven with him. Simply put, he went to the cross to deal with their spiritual need. As a Christian, we ought to be aware of the fact that people around us have a spiritual need. I started the message off this way saying that we tend to be focused on us and we totally miss the fact that there are people around us, that there might actually be people around us that need something. We ought to be aware, we need to be aware of the fact that people around us have a spiritual need, and then we should do something about it. We should do something about it. I could go multiple different directions with this. I'm going to stay with the example that we see in this verse. We need to be aware that there are people around us that still have no shepherd. People around us that, as we see in this verse, are scattered. They're lost. And if we'll actually open our eyes and look, we're going to see that. Because it's pretty obvious. But when we see that, rather than turning a blind eye and pretending it didn't exist, which is what we often do because we don't want to have to inconvenience ourselves, and rather than just saying, well, that's too bad that there are so many lost people, someone should go to them, which again is what we often do. We see that there's lost all around us, but we don't want to go, and so I love it when people do this. I'll pray that God sends someone. Have you ever thought, maybe you're that someone? Here's the idea. See that there is an eternal spiritual need in those around you and have some compassion. Not compassion that ends at pity. Not compassion that ends at, boy, I feel bad for the place they are in. But compassion that drives you to action. Compassion that drives you to be a witness to them. Compassion that drives you to tell them of the Savior. I'm going to wrap the message up kind of right here. I'll bring it all together right here. Christian, have some compassion. Have some compassion. Again, I know, as I said at the start, it's not something we like to talk about, but have some compassion. Get your focus off of you and notice the needs around you. And then don't just make note of them and feel bad or hope someone else will do something, but you do something. Learn to be a compassionate Christian, one who models his life after Christ, who sees people's needs. Again, their physical, emotional, and most importantly, their spiritual need, and then, to the best of your ability, do something about it. Do something about it. But then as I preach this morning, I know the majority has been focused toward the Christian, but I can't help but think maybe there's someone here who would be in that last crowd, that would fit in the group of people who Jesus looked at and had compassion because they had no shepherd. I'll tell you something, his compassion didn't end there. It wasn't just for the multitude that was gathered around him there. He still has compassion on you. And what he did on the cross still pays the price for you. All we have to do is ask. And in just a moment, I'm going to say this and then I'll pray and we'll have the invitation this morning. If you're here and you don't know Christ, come accept the one who had compassion on you. Let's pray.